Good morning. Thank you for joining the KFAS 50th Anniversary Celebration Conference. My name is Jiyeoun, a professor at the Graduate School of International Studies at Seoul National University. Today's theme is the celebrating liberal democracy as one of the part of this overarching theme. As a first session, today we are going to discuss the U.S. election as implication. As Professor Fukuyama mentioned about the November election is one of the very important, not only its domestic policy, but also its global implication. So as you know, this year is a super election, but we already have many elections, but the biggest thing is November in the US. So today we invite the four renowned the speakers for this issue. So I will briefly introduce our speaker. To my left, Professor Michael MCFAUL at Stanford University. Professor McFaul, he was also served as the U.S. ambassador to Russia during the Obama administration. And to the next, the Professor Sang-eung Ha at Sogang University. And then Professor Hae-young Ryu from Princeton University. And Professor Veronica ANGHEL from European Union Institute. So we invite four speakers, and each speaker, they are going to give a 7 to 8 minutes short speech, and then I will having some questions, and then they will respond. And as order of the presentation, we decide to start with Professor Sang-eung Ha. He is going to talk about the prediction of the U.S. election based on survey and polling data. As the next, Professor McFaul is going to talk about the U.S. election and its implication for the global context. And then Professor ANGHEL will talk about the European election, but the implication for the EU context. And lastly, Professor Yu is going to talk about the U.S. domestic politics, what will happen. So why don't we start with our the speaker, starting from the Professor Ha.
Thank you for introduction. Yeah, I'm Ha Sang-eung, the political science affiliated with the political science department at Sogang University, South Korea. I'm studying public opinion, political psychology, and the U.S. politics. And then I'm also writing and commentating on the ongoing U.S. election as of now, from time to time. Okay, so I was assigned to predict the outcome. Okay, so, but usually, political scientists do not predict. This is actually what the fortune tellers do. Okay, but I feel a little bit relieved to predict the outcome of the 2024 election because I was wrong 8 years ago. Okay, like many of you did. Okay, I was wrong. So the making a wrong prediction once, that hurts, but making a wrong prediction twice, that doesn't hurt much. So I'm gonna say that as of now, I cautiously believe that Biden has a good chance of winning the election. That's my prediction. And I'm going to give you some reasons why I think in that way. So first thing I would like to say is the reason why I'm predicting that Biden has a good chance of winning the election. And then second thing I would like to talk about is the challenges the Biden and Biden administration face now, to win the election. The four challenges. Okay, first of all, Biden has a good chance of winning the election when we see the situation of a battleground state in 2024 election. So we have, the 5 states as a battleground states now. They are Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia. And some scholars add Nevada or North Carolina to that list, but we are usually talking about 5 battleground states. So among those 5 battleground states, if Biden wins Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, then the Biden can secure 270 electoral votes out of 538. So Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. And then Biden actually won in those states 4 years ago. And then Biden actually won in those states by defeating Trump, the current challenger. So that means Biden knows how to win in those elections, in those states. Okay, that's one thing. Conversely, in order for Trump to win the election, Trump has to win in Arizona and Georgia because in those 2 states, the winning of a margin was really, really small. Okay, that's the easiest states. The Trump can get back. And winning in Arizona, Georgia, that is not enough for Trump. Okay, so Trump has to win in Arizona, Georgia, and then Trump has to win at least one of the three states I mentioned. So Michigan or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania. So that means the winning formula is much simpler for Biden than Trump. And then we know, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania is categorized as a blue war state. Okay, it has a lot of the shared commonalities. It's basically represented by the white, blue-collar, working-class voters. And Biden actually tried to appeal to their voices. Okay, so they actually moved, originally supported the Democratic Party for a long time, and they moved to Trump in 2016, and then went back to Biden, the Democratic Party, in 2020. So that said, since the winning formula for Biden is simpler than the Trump, that's why I'm saying that the Biden has a good chance of winning the election. But the problem is the Biden administration and Biden still have some challenges. There are four of them, I would like to say. The first one is inflation. The second one is relatively low support from racial minority groups. The third one is a turnout issue. The last but the least issue is his age and his health. But I'm not going to say anything about it because God knows. So it's not something I can do. Okay, so I'm going to focus on three the challenges that I mentioned regarding the Biden administration's re-election campaign. So first, inflation. So everybody knows that the macroeconomic indices are good now. So inflation is tamed, and then the unemployment rate is relatively low. So on paper, every single thing related to macroeconomic condition looks good. But I still think that the inflation matters in determining the outcome because even though inflation has been tamed, voters still remember what the prices were 4 years ago. So that's the problem. Okay. So what Biden has to do is let voters forget those prices. But that's something not Biden can do. So this is what we have to see. So either the voters forget the prices 4 years ago or 3 years ago, or the voters actually get accustomed to the current situation. Okay, so wages is good, and even though that we have to pay more, but so everything else is good. Okay, if the perception of voters becomes and then moved to that way, then that will definitely help Biden's re-election. But in October or in November, or in September or October, still, most of the voters, still think about the prices 4 years or 3 years ago. Then that's going to be a big problem for Biden's re-election campaign. That's the first one, and the second one is the lower support from racial minorities, especially black young male voters. It's a big problem. So usually, racial minorities, the blacks and Hispanics, consistently supported the Democratic Party. Of course, bar is too high. So when you are talking about the support from the racial minorities to the Democratic Party, the bar is actually made during the Obama administration. But in Obama administration and Obama campaigns, so 95% or 96% of black voters actually supported him. So the bar is too high. I admit it. But still, when I see the polls now, the significantly large number of black and Hispanic voters say that I'm not going to vote for Biden in November. But that does not necessarily mean that they will vote for Trump. So what they will do is, I'm not satisfied with the Biden administration, and I'm not going to vote for Trump. Then option is, I'm not going to vote. Lower level of turnout. That's the problem. But that is a little bit puzzling because the Biden administration actually did a lot. As we know, the Biden administration passed a series of landmark laws, including IRA, CHIPS and Science Act, and Infra Act. But the legislative efforts eventually designed to help working class white people living in blue wards, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, but not necessarily helping the black and Hispanic voters. So Biden tried actually to help them, the racial minorities. One good example is his executive order of canceling student debt. But that was struck down the Supreme Court, and then Biden actually revamped that program, the student debt cancellation program, and tried to relaunch it 2 or 3 months ago. So I'm not sure whether the reattempt to cancel student debt have a good effect, and then the positive effect that the Biden administration expected, in November election. But still, the Biden tried to show, I'm actually hearing your voices, to racial minority voters. That's the second thing I would like to mention. And the third one is the turnout. So there's a big difference between 2020 and 2024 election, which is the 2020 election was held during the pandemic, while the 2024 election is, like I say, normal election. So during the pandemic, one important and significant change in U.S. electoral system is widespread usage of vote by mail. But we know Biden was significantly benefited by vote by mail in 2020. So as you know, the electoral system is not managed by federal government. The electoral system is managed and run by state government. So what you have to look at is what kind of changes have been made regarding a vote by mail system across the state, especially within the battleground states. So if the mail-in vote system remains, that will help Biden get reelected. If the mail-in vote system is repealed or changed significantly, asking the voters to actually turn out to vote, in a polling station, then that will hurt Biden's re-election chance. The turnout matters. And then the last one is health. That again, I said I don't know. So who knows? So I'm going to stop here, and I have something to say about Trump, but I'm going to do that in the second round. Okay.
Yep. Thank you for your wonderful kind of speech. And then next speaker is Professor McFaul.
Well, thank you. It's a great honor to be here. I want to congratulate the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies. Just tremendous what you've done. I think all countries in the world should study what you've done and emulate it. I think it's a fantastic achievement for your country and our relations with our countries together. The second thing, I would love just to comment on everything that was just said. I have a lot of opinions about American politics, and I participate in American politics on the Democratic side, but maybe we'll save that for questions, because my assignment was to talk about the implications for the U.S. election for the world, and I'm going to talk about it, the implications for American foreign policy, because by implication, that has implications for the entire world. And I know that everybody wants me to talk about Trump, and I will, don't get me wrong, I'll get to that. But I want to just spend 30 seconds on what might be the implications for American foreign policy should President Biden win re-election. Because I think we just think it's just going to be continuity. And I think that's easy. If you have to have a 5-second soundbite on television, it's just continuity. But I can tell you, I used to work with many people in the Biden administration. I worked 5 years in the Obama administration. And that's not the way they see it. They see a re-election as a chance for a real opportunity. And I'll limit myself, because I want to get to Trump, to 3 big things. Number one, they think, and I agree with them, by the way, on this, that their greatest foreign policy accomplishments have been structuring a response to China's rise. And that, of course, includes your country. And they have done multiple things. I won't go through them now. I can in questions. Institutional things, policy changes, including American domestic policy, but also multilateral initiatives that I think have been consequential. I would even say historic, especially with regard to what has been done with respect to the relationship with South Korea and Japan and the United States. But they feel that if they lose and they do not have 4 more years, all of that work will fall apart. And so I think, especially for this region of the world, that a Biden re-election will give them a chance to institutionalize a lot of things that they've started. And we can talk about pluses and minuses of everything they've done, but in general, I think it's been a very smart, strategic approach, and they just think they need 4 more years to institutionalize it. The second thing that they talk about, this may be somewhat controversial, but with respect to the wars that they have had to deal with, right? I worked in the government. You get to do your transition plan. I helped to write our transition plan from Bush to Obama. And then I was going to quote my mother. I won't. It's because there's too many cameras here. But then things happen. She likes a different word that begins with S-H-I-T that you don't get to control for. And that's what happened to the Biden administration in Afghanistan. Obviously, the horrible barbaric invasion of Ukraine and the war in the Middle East. And in 2 of those instances that I just described, it is their perception that they can't do more aggressive things and that we can't get to solutions because in their view, we can talk about whether I agree with it or not, but in 2 of those instances, they're dealing with 2 leaders, Mr. Putin and Mr. Netanyahu, who actually don't want President Biden to win re-election. And that constrains their ability to do things. Once the election is over, and the case I know the best, it's without question clear that Putin wants Trump to win. And as a result, getting anything done in an ambitious way with regard to that war simply won't happen until the election. Once the election happens, and Mr. Putin has to get used to the fact that President Biden will be in office for 4 more years and that Mr. Trump has no chance of coming back, that will change the different kinds of things that they might be able to do in that case. So it's not just continuity. The election most certainly with regard to the war in Ukraine, but I also think with regard to the Middle East, there'll be changes as a result if Mr. Biden is reelected. And then finally, just a footnote to this, it'll just give them 4 more years of distance to what was a very unsuccessful withdrawal from Afghanistan from their own perspective that haunts them today, and Mr. Trump is going to remind them of that in the next couple of months. But 4 years down the road, their expectation is that the scar tissue from that difficult transition will be forgotten. So they think there's actually not just continuity if they win. But now Trump, because that's what you all care about. And I'm heartened to hear, let's make no mistake, I have very clear preferences for who I want to win in this election. And it's not just because that I worked for Vice President Biden. I'm a part of the campaign in a marginal way. I want him to win, and I'm doing everything I can to help. I don't want to be, I don't want to pretend to be some analytic nonpartisan today. I want to be clear about my views. But it's not just about that. It's about what Professor Fukuyama said, that I do think this is a consequential election, not just about policies between Democrats and Republicans, but about democracy as well, and we're going to talk about that later, and I have lots of things I'd like to say about American domestic institutions maybe next time around. But let me conclude on foreign policy. Because you remember what Frank said, what Professor Fukuyama said, leaders have consequences. Everything is not just structurally determined. I think I agree with that generally, but especially in foreign policy, our Constitution gives the president more capabilities and authority to do more things than he can do compared to domestic political issues. And I would say there are 3 things to remember about Trump 1 versus Trump 2. First, Trump didn't think he was going to win the election. We now have lots of memoirs and things that have been written about it. So he was not prepared to implement a grand strategy with regard to foreign policy. He is way more prepared today. That's a big difference. And when I'm going to grossly oversimplify in the interest of time, but I think on 3 different dimensions, you're going to see a much more aggressive Trump. So 1, Trump is in the world of engagement versus isolationist, he's the most isolationist president we've had in many, many decades, and he will be more isolationist if he wins. Number two, with respect to multilateralism versus unilateralism, Trump is very unilateral. I wrote an article several years ago called the Trump Withdrawal Doctrine, when he pulled out of many, many agreements. By the way, Biden tried to get us back into some of those agreements, but did not succeed. Trump had consequences of pulling out of many things that that Mr. Biden has not gone back to. He will be more unilateral, that's my prediction, if he is reelected. And then number three, another big difference is that because he didn't know that he was going to win, he actually consulted with, I would call, establishment Republicans, including many that work at Stanford, about who to bring into his government, because he didn't have a roster of people to bring in. And we can talk about individuals maybe the next time around, but there were lots of people that I disagreed with on some policy measures. But when I looked at the Trump team, and these are many people I know well, these were professional people, right? Secretary Mattis, General McMaster, even Pompeo, who I disagree with on a lot of things. These are people that had some involvement, well, with Mattis, decades of involvement, but they were a kind of constraint on Trump's more crazy impulses. And Trump himself has talked about them in that way. None of them will be back for Trump 2. I think it's really, really important to remember. None of those people I just mentioned will be invited back to work with him because he felt like they were constraining him, and now he wants to do all those things that I just described. And the last thing that will be different, Trump 2 versus Trump 1, is that this time around, he will feel like he has an even stronger mandate from the American people to pivot to more isolationist policies, more unilateral policies. And when I left out on democracy, supporting democracy, he never did that during the Trump era. The Trump administration did, and the Congress did. Trump himself never did. So on that trifecta, unilateralism, isolationism, and I would just say no support for democracy, he will feel, because he's won re-election, that he has a mandate to do all those things from the American people, and he doesn't need to listen to the elites within his own party or the elites from academia, most certainly not me, and that, I think, is a very dangerous world. With one caveat, and then I'll end, and maybe we'll talk about this. Even if Trump wins re-election, we will not become a dictatorship overnight. I actually don't think we will in general, but even on foreign policy, there are other actors, there are other institutions that shape foreign policy. I remember working for President Obama, sometimes he was frustrated by that, by Congress, by the media, by interest groups, by popping off, academics popping off on the pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post. I remember very vividly one day I went in to see the president for a briefing on something else, and he had just read an op-ed, I don't think the president would mind you telling me, by a guy named Bob Kagan in the Washington Post. And I could not believe how animated he was about that op-ed. It's like, why do you care about Bob Kagan? I care deeply about Bob Kagan. I know Bob Kagan. But the point is, there's an ecosystem that the president to conduct foreign policy exists in, and he will not be able to do all those things despite having all those advantages that I just talked about. And for me, a key outcome of November is the House of Representatives, where, it's depending on how you count, there's 4 seats that they have to flip, the Democrats to remain control, and I think that is vitally important as a constraint on some of the things I just talked about that Mr. Trump wants to do. And even if it isn't, there's these other things that I think that will help to constrain him. And the final thing I'll say is I just don't think he was that effective as an executive. And maybe this is really, pulling for straws now of hope. But I hope that he won't be that effective in all the things that he says he wants to do in foreign policy, because he's just not that effective as an executive. He just is not that committed to his ideas. But maybe that's just looking for hope in an otherwise, I think, dire time for American foreign policy should Mr. Trump win re-election.
Thank you so much for very insightful comments, Professor McFaul. And then the next speaker is Professor Veronica ANGHEL.
Thank you so much for having me here. I could not congratulate the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies more for having started this partnership with Europe as well. We've been spending a couple of days engaged in conversations, and I keep stressing the point that Europe matters. And even if there are these rising global powers, and even if we are sometimes in a position to talk more about the past than the future, it is vital that we continue these conversations and give the role, a central role to what's happening in Europe as well. And I have to tell you that the picture is not great. I do not come bearing good news from the European continent and European Union. Before I talk about that, I was asked to talk about the implications of elections and in the United States and United States foreign policy on the European Union. And it's hard to overstate the effect that the United States has on Europe. It has an immense effect on how the European Union builds its security, its economy, and even develops its democracy. Right now, the challenges that we are facing in the European Union, but also in our direct neighborhood, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, are enormous. We have to decide whether we are going to have, finally, a common foreign and security policy, which is what the European Union does not have. It's very complicated to govern the European Union, and it takes a lot of time to explain how it works. But trust me, we need to get our stuff together, and we need to build a common security and defense policy. This means that all the member states are now challenged to set aside minor national interests and realize that we're going through transformative moments, and it is quite possible that the United States is not going to be there to secure our common defense and foreign policy, and to give us some direction. So no matter what happens in the United States elections in November, we have a lot of choices to make in Europe. So I'll start with the problem of security, and then we can talk more about democracy as well. We have a war in our direct neighborhood. So if we talk about the European Union, we cannot not take into account the invasion of Ukraine. This war is nowhere near an ending. No matter how much we would like peace to establish in Europe, this war is going to go on. And it's going to go on because the Kremlin, President Putin, does not want it to end. Ukraine wants it to end, but they are also very much invested, and for all the right reason, in a just peace. That means a victory for Ukraine. That means Ukraine taking back its territories and preserving its sovereignty and preserving its independence. And this is not what Russia wants. So all the promises about peace and ceasefire and etc., those are just requests for capitulation. We have just had a visit from President Putin in North Korea, proving once again that Russia is actually a pretty weak power, aligning with small powers and searching authoritarian partners in its foreign policy. So whatever we hear about their interest in securing peace and ceasefire, etc., that is just rhetoric. It is not true. So we have to deal with this. And whatever happens in the United States, this war is still going to be there. Now, just like Ambassador McFaul mentioned, it also matters who is going to win these elections. A Trump choice is going to increase the instability and is going to lower trust in the United States' commitments to its partners. We have seen these declarations repeatedly coming out of the previous Trump administration, and it's very likely that he will be even more emboldened this time around to make the kind of choices that are going to be detrimental for the transatlantic partnership. If a Biden administration continues, that's also a challenge, because it doesn't change the fact that Europe is a mere tripwire until the United States comes to the rescue if this war overflows and goes beyond the borders of Ukraine. So we have a lot of things to do when it comes to building our own defense and security policy. And I'm stressing this because in relation to the United States, this is the most important thing that we need to do. To achieve this, the European Union is embarking on transformation within, and these conversations exist. It's just that it's very slow, and it's bureaucratic, and you have to secure consensus. The European Union is a consensus-making machine, but it is not fast. And it's very democratic as well. So this is going to be a challenge for Europe. Now, the other issue that we are dealing with is the rise of the far right. I keep hearing the talks about populism. And don't get me wrong, it's important. But we have a bigger problem. We have actual neo-Nazis that have now entered the European Parliament in greater numbers. We have anti-Semitism that is being legitimized by elections. We have very serious issues with anti-European movements that want nation states and nationalism, and not the good kind, the bad kind, to take over the way that you conduct policy in the European Union. And we have a lot of people that are simply anti-democratic, who want to secure power and then not accept a peaceful transition to another regime, if that is possible. So in that way, seeing what happens in the United States is also important for Europe, because this partnership has been going on for a very long time. So we can both emulate as well as inspire the United States with the authoritarian politics that certain member states in Europe are undergoing. So in that way, the partnership still exists, because we are giving both the example and heeding the example of the United States. But in other ways, the transatlantic relationship is not moving ahead the way it should be under the great threats that we are under. And this is a question that I hope we can also debate more about. It's not just what we're going to do now, but to create a stable peace, we have to agree on that post-war global order. How is that world going to look like? What is the role that Russia is going to play in it? What role do we ascribe to China? These are not questions that are being answered in an overarching narrative in the West. So in that sense, Western leadership is leaving a lot to be desired and a lot of space for other powers to fill. So I'm going to leave it here with the question about whether we know for ourselves what we want. And this is quite difficult to achieve without a strong transatlantic partnership and a strong Western leadership together with its democratic partners, of which Korea is one. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the comments, Professor Anghel. And our last but not least, the speaker, I want to invite Professor Hye Young.
Great. It's such an honor to be here. 18 years ago, I did an interview for the scholarship to go abroad. And after interview, I thought I wouldn't get this. I cried so much and calling my boyfriend, now my husband, that I will not get that. But 18 years later, I'm on stage with distinguished scholars and celebrating 50 years of anniversary of this foundation. So I'm very honored. And also my mentor from Seoul National, Young here, he is here, so I'm very honored. I study American politics. I'm associate professor, Princeton, politics and international affairs, and my expertise in lobbying and American political institutions. So I study how interest groups and especially business, use a lobbying to lobby, American members of a Congress and a bureaucrat, etc. So I see this election in terms of what's happening. Depending on who's winning, what kind of changes we'll see in terms of U.S. domestic policies. So I have 3 messages. The first point is that if your preferred candidate doesn't win, don't be panicked. So here's the reason. So if you know the quintessential nature of American politics is a status quo. So as Ambassador McFaul says, American politics, big changes doesn't come. So that's why when you see in American politics, you should not approach the way you approach Korean politics. In Korea, every 5-year election, whenever we have a new president, there's a big bang. Everything changes. There's a new policy agenda. President has a lot of power both in domestic and foreign policies, but that's not the case in the US. Yes, US president has a lot of power, maybe more in foreign policy, but even in foreign policy, there's a lot of, the constraint on president power. Because we have a separation of powers, Congress, bureaucrat and the judiciary, and then they try to constrain the unilateral exercise of the US president. And also because of polarization, it's really hard to make a big policy changes. And also, we have interest groups in the US, Democratic, Republican-leaning interest groups are very balanced. So it's really hard to tilt, the policies into one direction. So there is a lot of, articles, if Trump wins, is he going to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act or a CHIPS Act? Think about it. So Trump might get rid of some of the proposition within the IRA, but repealing the entire IRA is impossible. So IRA, is a huge legislation, $145 billion investment, and I looked at, what is the budget of South Korea? It's around, $600 billion, so it's almost 1/3 of the Koreans, budget, Korean government's budget. And if you look at this IRA, there are a lot of actually parts that benefit Republican district. So there is a Brookings report that 45% of the bipartisan infrastructure, the funding is actually going to rural America, which strongly support President Trump. So even if you do not like, big government spending, if you do not like, IRA, no one really hates money coming into your pocket. No one hates money coming to your district. So think about, the now Samsung, building a big semiconductor company in the Taylor City, Texas. Who's representing this district? This is a Texas 31st district represented by John Carter, who is a Republican. He's a strongly support investment by the Samsung in his district because that helps him, next election. But he didn't vote for IRA. And then I know the SK-owned and LG, they are building some battery companies in northern Georgia, Georgia 1st District. Who's representing this district? Buddy Carter, another Republican. So these people are proponent of this Biden era agenda. So even if Trump becomes a president, I think it's really difficult to overhaul entire Biden agenda. So we have to think about, because of the separation of power, constraints, and you will not see a big bang changes, okay? My second point is that know who's actually making policy in the US. So we think US president has a lot of discretions, but also Congress might have a lot of discretion, but who's making policy? Bureaucrats. So in Korean, 시행세칙. So think about IRA again. So after Congress passed the IRA, so IRA, if you look at the bill, is over 800 pages. You might think this bill has a lot of detailed content. Not necessarily. So, you might heard the news that, Hyundai, they failed to lobby in terms of, the electric vehicle subsidies. And if you look at the IRA specific bill, there's a section 13401, and there they talk about we'll provide the electric car subsidy to clean vehicles if it's assembled finally in North America, right? And then we know that what North America means, but what is a clean vehicle? Is a Tesla clean vehicle? Kia's new EV clean vehicle. Who's actually defining the definition of a clean vehicle? Bureaucrats. So after Congress passed the IRA, the Treasury Department, U.S. Treasury Department defines these terms, key terms through rulemaking. So in a Korean context, basically that means 행정부 makes a kind of 시행사칙. So then there is another article that Ford, Tesla, GM, they actually lobby the Treasury Department to change the definition of clean energy, a clean car, clean vehicle, so that their cars actually benefited from these programs, right? And also think about CHIPS Act. And the CHIPS Act, there is a particular clause that says that if you are the beneficiary of CHIPS Act funding, you cannot, conduct a research, joint research or a licensing with a foreign country of concerns. So what is a foreign country of concern? Does that mean China? Does that mean Russia? Who's defining the term foreign country of concern? Commerce Department. Within the Commerce Department, there is a very small bureau called the BI, the Bureau of, Bureau of Information and National Standard. There are 100 bureaucrats, but they are actually making these terms and definition through the rulemaking. So what does that mean? So even if you miss the opportunity to lobby Congress or president, still there are a lot of access points from the Korean government or Japanese government or Korean companies that you can actually lobby and influence the political policymaking process in the U.S. And the third point that I want to make is that, so maybe related to the foreign policy point as well, China. So anti-China sentiment, that's very prevalent in the US. So recently there is a survey by the Pew Research Center, that conduct a lot of public opinion survey. 83% of Republicans see China negatively. How about Democrats? We know the polarization, Democrats, Republicans, they don't agree on anything except anti-Chinese sentiment. 73% of Democrats also see China negatively. So you might think, US always see China in a very hostile manner. No, if you go back to 2005, less than 40% of both Democrats and Republicans see China in a negative angle. So over the time, you see that the anti-Chinese sentiment really, really increased a lot. And that's why the Democrats and Republicans in Congress, they were united to pass TikTok bans and other measures. CHIPS Act is basically that's compete with the China bill. So what does that imply in terms of domestic policies? So I think there is actually dangerous sentiment in Korea, especially among the policymakers, that having Trump at the White House is beneficial to Korea. You have to think twice. Here's the reason. So Trump's policy is very simple. He won decoupling from China, so that means more unilateralism, America first, and isolationism, right? And what kind of policies he actually implemented to achieve his goal? Increase tariff on Chinese product. That's really easy policy. So from strategic perspective, Trump policy toward China is very easy to understand. Right? As a company, you have to navigate, supply chains, etc. But at the same time, you should not just, look at his rhetorics, how effective, his policy was, especially imposing tariff on Chinese product. So there is a really interesting academic articles that show that, China, of course, retaliated. And China increased, tariff on U.S. product, but China was very strategic. China increased tariff on the product produced by Trump supporting district. Then Trump supported voters, they complained. we cannot really export our, grains and potatoes to China. And then, the Republican politicians, they actually lobby Trump to reduce the tariff. And also, he signed the executive order, Buy American Act. So that means if you sell your product to American government, you actually have to have a certain levels of, the companies that or product that made in the U.S. But only tiny fraction of companies that sell product to U.S. government have a supply from China. So there is a lot of constraints. How much the Trump's rhetorics and policies, anti-Chinese policy could do. But it's very simple to understand. But what kind of opportunity does the policy actually bring to Korean firms and Korean government? Very little, right? So you just navigate this risk. But think about Biden policy. So Biden also has actually, he actually continue Trump era tariff on Chinese product, and his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, he also has a pretty hawkish view on China. But Biden policy is protect American product and compete with China. So his policy is more complicated vis-a-vis the competition with China. So what does that mean? Yes, he wants to bring semiconductor manufacturing to U.S., and that means actually Korean companies and Korean government might have an opportunity, right? It's really hard to navigate his policies because it's not simple as a Trump policies, but that means it imposes both costs and opportunities. Right? So when Biden tried to bring these chips factories into the U.S. and Korea, we have great companies that could contribute the productions, and that means Korean government and then companies investing in the U.S. district. That's a very positive sign from the Biden's perspective. So I think Korean companies and government have opportunity to explore that. But when it comes to Trump policies, I think that there is a much limited opportunity for Korean companies and government. And at the same time, Biden's big agenda is a climate change. But the problem is to curb climate change, one of the most important things is a transition to green energy. The fact that China is a leading company in terms of solar panels, electric vehicle, that actually imposes another challenge. So that means because of anti-Chinese sentiment, Biden's initiative in terms of climate change, that may not as fast as a lot of people expect, right? So what I want to say is that this anti-Chinese sentiment and competition with China has a huge consequences on both domestic and foreign policies. So we have to really take it seriously when we think about the consequences of this election. So I'll stop here.
Thank you so much for all the very interesting comments, Professor Yu. And each speaker actually laid out very interesting points. Actually, they are not really overlapping with one another, but at the same time, there's kind of tension and also kind of different interpretation how they view the U.S. election. So Professor Haas briefly mentioned about why Biden has a good chance of winning, and so at the same time he mentioned the challenges is by focusing on the inflation, and the other one is the law supporting from the racial minority. At the same time, turnout and age and the health problem. And Professor McFaul mentioned about how U.S. policy, especially foreign policy, might be different between the 4 years by Biden administration plus the Trump, especially Trump. If the Trump 1 and Trump 2, it was huge differences. In particular, Professor McPherson mentioned about, which is slightly different from what Professor Yu just mentioned, about institutionalization might be very challenged during the Trump administration. That's another part. And Professor ANGHEL mentioned about the implication for the EU context, especially what's going on in the EU, especially EU in itself, at the same time, transatlantic partnership, which might be more important. And Professor Yu just mentioned about how even if Mr. Trump came back to power, it may not be so kind of shocking or huge difference in policymaking. So she mentioned about more institutional resilience in a sense, there are check and balance and other constraints on the presidency. So these are the 4 main speakers' themes and an argument. And based on their presentations, I want to briefly just ask 1 or 2 questions to each presenter, and then you might just feel free to answer to my question and also add some more that you have thought about the issues about U.S. presidential election. So first, I want to start with Professor Ha's point. So as we know, the U.S. although we are looking at the polling data, but usually we are zooming in the swing state. So you mentioned 3 key states for Biden administration. So there are let's say, slightly high chances to win that election. But at the same time, recently, across not only the national but also even the state level, actually, Biden does not seem to be doing well in these swing states. So I'm just wondering, what is your evaluation? Why it's not really so different in margin-wise? That's my first question. And relate to that part, I think among many issues, and you mentioned the inflation, which is related to economics, but actually objective indicator looks okay. However, people's subjective evaluation is different. So if so, how, as you mentioned, it's not easy to narrow the gap because people's evaluation might not be changed dramatically. And then what will be some the Biden campaign's kind of strategy to a bit narrow it down or change people's view on the evaluation? And another one is, which is another interesting part of the racial kind of the issue. So in the U.S. election, usually a woman, a minority, they prefer to support the Democrats. But as you point out, some black, especially young black people in rural area, they are less likely. And recently, I just read this newspaper article, even female, they are still supporting for Democrat Biden, but their margins actually much smaller. So I'm wondering, the traditional cleavage for the traditional supporting for the Democrat or Biden, it seems to be much weaker. And in this context, still do you consider Biden has much higher chance of the winning election? That's my question to Professor Hao. And I have also a question to Professor McFaul. And Professor McFaul, let's discover what will be the huge kind of difference between the foreign policy perspective, its implication, especially if we think about the Trump administration and Biden administration. During the Trump administration, the primary emphasis is U.S., the America first. That's the issue. And he did take into account alliance as serious as possible. At the same time, there are also many conflict and tension with NATO and Asian allies. But you also mentioned about during the Biden administration, there's some institutionalization effort, so which might be huge departure if there's a regime or the administration change. So my question is, if that's the case, so what will be in this kind of election, still U.S. election, mostly people talk about domestic politics. So from the U.S. voters' perspective, the international foreign policy may not be as important as critical it is. But having said that, but it's very important for global consequences. So I'm wondering, what will be the implication for the Asian allies for this election? At the same time, I know you are the expert in these Russian cases, so what will be the consequence for the Russian-Ukraine kind of war situation? That's kind of my question to Professor McFaul. And Professor ANGHEL, you just mentioned about the transatlantic, the partnership is very important. But at the same time, if we think about the last Trump administration, there's a huge kind of the tension between the U.S. attitude to NATO. Even he bluntly says the NATO should be more responsible, even paying-wise or responsibility. So I was wondering, what kind of a debate is going on within EU? So is there some discussion, what if Biden is continuing the administration, and what if Trump came back to power, and what will be the relationship between the U.S. and NATO, especially security context? That's my question. And my question to Professor Yu is, she mentioned about the U.S. Domestic politics, especially institutional resilience. It can be still just many check and balance. There are many points. President cannot do everything, whatever he wants. But at the same time, they're also concerned, even the many American politics scholars, there also institutional can be a bit declining in decade. So although there are still many institutional resilience, check and balance, putting constraint on the presidential power, but there are many effort and also there's attempt actually undermining this institutional let's say, how would I say, protection or last guideline. So in this context, you mentioned about more institutional resiliency, but is there any other some cases you might just illustrate? There are some counterexample actually during the Trump administration, even other cases, these existing institutions might be challenged, and it has another implication for them.
How many hours do we get to answer all those great questions?
Whatever you want. So perhaps maybe 5 minutes per the presenter. So either probably our presidential order, and then we also have some questions from the floor. So we to save time for that. So 4 to 5 minutes might be good. Thank you.
3 minutes. Okay, I'm going to be short. The first question Professor Song raised is the polling result in battleground states. So there are some the polling companies such as the New York Times and CNN College polls and then Bloomberg News polls keep showing us that Trump is leading in most of the battleground states as of now. But don't be fooled by that result because if you look at the numbers, I mean, those numbers are almost all of those numbers are still within the margin of errors. So that means statistically speaking, there's no difference between Biden and Trump in terms of supporting those the battleground states. So we will see what will happen. So as of now, I mean, so nothing is clear. And then the second, the big disparity between the objective economic condition and the subjective evaluation of economic condition. I mean, that's a big topic. So when I was in the PhD program, then when I studied U.S. politics, one of the theories I learned is retrospective voting theory. So which means that if the macroeconomic condition is good, then the voters will vote for incumbent, and then if the macroeconomic condition is bad, then voters will likely to vote for challenger. I mean, that's the main the message of retrospective voting theory. It doesn't work anymore because of a polarization. So now, if the president is a Democrat, then Republicans think that the economy is bad, regardless of the objective condition. Likewise, if the president is a Republican, then Democrats among the electorate are likely to think that the economic condition is bad. So I mean, it's unfortunate. I mean, that's basically the same case, same here, I mean, in South Korea. But so the big disparity between the perception and the reality, okay, and that affects the electoral outcome. And then still, I mean, as of now, we don't know what to do. So I mean, that's the big problem. So that's what the Biden administration should definitely overcome to get reelected. Okay, and then I would like to add one more thing, okay, regarding the Democratic coalition. There's a book written by Guy Grossman and his colleague. They published 6 or 7 years ago, and then their argument is basically the two major political parties in the United States are completely different. So Republican parties are based on ideology, while the Democratic Party based on interest. Okay, so which means Democratic Party is basically a coalition of different interest groups, while the Republicans are more likely to mobilize people based on ideology values. Okay. I'm not 100% agree with their arguments, but that's the point. So the Democratic Party has always a problem of keeping and maintaining the coalition. And now that's the case. I mean, Obama coalition that they encompass the minorities and then highly educated people and then the young people. I mean, that is a really, really good coalition and gain a lot of support. But Biden, by comparison, as of now, may fail to maintain it. But still, I mean, the coalition is necessarily, I mean, just to win the election, so to get the majority vote or majority vote, I mean, among the electoral college. So I mean, that's something that the Biden administration focus on. I mean, that's why I'm saying that even though the Korean newspaper doesn't say much about it, the raising support among the racial minority groups, I mean, that's one of the key points. I mean, the Biden administration should address now, and then they are doing it. So, and then regarding Trump, last thing I would like to mention. The key message of Trump's the campaign is one word: revenge, retaliation. Okay, and then Trump, as a person like us, has 24 hours a day, and then 365 days a year. So that means there's a time limit. So Trump said a lot of things. I mean, if I go to re-enter the White House, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. But he will not do and cannot do, I mean, all things, I mean, he mentioned, even though he re-entered the White House, I mean, this November. So 4 more years. So unless the Trump changed the US Constitution, the 22nd Amendment, he has just 4 years. Then he said a lot of things to do. But what we have to worrying about is, like, we know, I mean, what he will do, because he said a lot, but what we have to focus on is what kind of priorities he has in mind. So which one he will be able to first, and then which one he will be able to the last. Okay, and then to my opinion, okay, because I mean his main message is revenge or retaliation, he will focus on domestic issues. Okay, relatively ignoring the foreign issues. I mean, that may be, good news for us because, we are learning about the potential negative effect of the re-emergence, re-entering of the Trump administration. But we need to focus on the priorities and then see what kind of priorities Trump has in his mind, and then that's the point. And then related to that, the most dangerous promises Trump made is so-called Schedule F. The Schedule F is an executive order that intend to replace the current pre-existing bureaucrats with political appointees handpicked by Trump, by himself. And the Schedule F is important because, as the Professor Yu said, so most of important decisions are made by bureaucrats. And then the Schedule F, you read the proposal, the Trump want to replace almost all the members of bureaucracy, especially in the State Department, the Defense Department, the CIA. Okay, and then I'm not sure whether it will occur because there is obviously if the Trump would like to do that, then there is a legal challenges. That will take a long time, but that's definitely we have to take care of.
So lots of questions, and I'm going to look at the clock. You said 5 minutes. I'm just going to end whenever I get to 5 minutes. First, on whether foreign policy will play a role in the election, you're right. Traditionally, it doesn't. And I don't think the data I've seen, it won't in this election, with some caveats, with some pockets where particular groups care about particular foreign policy issues, and they happen to be in swing states. So the most obvious one is about Arab Americans in Michigan. They care a lot about Biden's policies there. They're really upset with them, and the Biden campaign is very nervous about that. Because remember, as was already been talked about, we're talking about really small margins in these swing states. That's a place where foreign policy is playing a very direct role. Generically, it's playing a role with younger people who are disillusioned with Biden. But the good news there from the Biden campaign is, one, most of those people don't vote anyway, so that they're not going to vote this time doesn't matter. And two, they're distributed in blue states, not just red states. But in Michigan, it matters a lot. It's a big focus, both for the campaign and for Congresswoman Alyssa Slotkin, who's running there, who's a moderate Democrat. She's a national security person. And when she's on the campaign trail, she talks about this issue. Second place where it matters. Most people are not going to vote for president based on your position on the war in Ukraine. But there's a group of people that care a lot about the war in Ukraine. They're people of, and I just used the hyphenate, I shouldn't do that. There are people whose families are from Poland, Lithuania, Ukraine, right? Eastern Europe. Guess where they live? They live in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. Polish Americans of Polish descent. You can't say Polish Americans anymore. I've been taught to try to do that, and it's just, I'm trying hard to learn. Excuse me. Voters with the greatest concentration of voters with Ukrainian roots is in the state of Pennsylvania. Now, it's not that big. They're small numbers, but these elections are going to be determined by small numbers. So those are places where it matters. On Ukraine, and I only have 2 minutes left, you asked a giant question about what will happen with respect to our support. I think Ukraine is where you'll see the first big movement. The President, Biden, has a firm view on that. Mr. Trump has a not as firm view, by the way. He finally was allowed and convinced to let the Congress vote the way they wanted to vote on the assistance package, but it took 6 months. And if you look at where they voted in September versus where they finally voted, the votes didn't change that much. But what happened in that period is he was signaling to them, you need to be, listen to me in order to the way you want to vote. And I know members of Congress in both houses who were quiet until they were given the red light that they could vote the way they wanted to because of Mr. Trump. And I know some that reversed the vote. And they reversed their vote because of their allegiance to Donald Trump. And it's just that clear. And that gets to another thing I think is important that I meant to say in my first comments related to this. Trump didn't really understand about the bureaucrats. He didn't really understand about the checks and balances. From what I hear, he didn't really follow the debates about the NDAA, right? Or the debates about voting for assistance programs for democracy. He wasn't paying attention. The budgets actually for the National Endowment for Democracy, if I'm not mistaken, Larry and Frank, they went up during the Trump term, right? That's because he wasn't paying attention. Now they're paying attention. Now they are focused in particular on foreign assistance and in particular on democracy assistance. And there's some people that I think are very radical that want to get rid of this. Now there'll be a fight because there are Democrats and Republicans that care, but there have been some very key Republicans because of their fear of Trump that are taking different positions on these issues than they were just 2 or 3 years ago when he wasn't really paying attention. And I think that'll be a big new dynamic. Last thing I want to say related to this. Remember, it's not just what Trump wants to do in the world. It's what countries, social movements, politicians in different countries, including your country, how they will react to a new Trump presidency. And I think there'll be a lot of hedging that goes on throughout the world, where they'll just say, okay, we thought America was a leader of the free world or the liberal international order or whatever you want to say, and now it's clear we're done. We're going back. We're going to try to put our head in the sand and all that stuff. And they will begin making decisions independent of what Trump actually does. In Europe, I hear it with the frontline states in Ukraine. They're already making contingency plans for if Mr. Trump wins, how they might have to defend themselves, even if it's not NATO that will do it. Around the world, you already see a lot of fence-sitters in terms of hedging with vis-a-vis China. If Trump wins, they're going to lean a different way. And dare I say, even in democratic societies, that you're going to see hedging, even if Trump does nothing. The very fact that he wins is going to make different kinds of groups rethink their relationship with the United States, and so it could have an unintended, unraveling consequence before he even does anything.
I'll take it from that exact point to answer the question about NATO. So first of all, it is in the interest of the United States to have a stable and committed and united NATO. And they have acknowledged this by finally passing through Congress a bill that is co-sponsored by both parties, a bill that does not allow any United States president to unilaterally withdraw the United States from NATO. And this is important without 2/3 of approval, of Congress approval. And this is very important because it acknowledges a concern that is bipartisan of what might happen in the case of a Trump return. And we already know, I was just Googling to make sure that I remember this right and I'm not misquoting Mr. Trump. He said that if he were to win, he would let Russia do whatever the hell they want because the Europeans deserve it, because they didn't invest in their defense, because they did not pay enough to deter into their own defense to deter Russia from doing anything similar to what they're doing right now in Eastern Europe. And that is a major concern, right? It's a major concern for the United States because it means that it is very likely that the perception, not only in Europe, but in other parts of the world, including in the South China Sea, would be that the United States is not going to stand by the commitments that it made to its allies. So this kind of instability, of course, matters for Europe. And Europe has invested a lot in its defense and has increased its defense budget at the level of nation states, but it's not enough. It's not enough because they have to also invest in their own security and manufacturing of weapons and defense systems. Because right now, whatever budget that we allocate, member states allocate to defense spending, is actually purchasing high-end technology from the United States, right? So that's, again, a problem. And we need to be much more self-reliant while taking supply chains into account. So in this situation, you cannot have individual states doing what they want and competing with each other. There has to be an integrated policy in which these countries, these member states, actually coordinate what they do with their supply chain, with their production, and how they use it. And this goes back to the policy of further European integration. I already know if I say European integration, everybody's going to start yawning, but it's important. It just means more Europe, less nation states. And that is vital because there is no way that you can deal with what is happening in Europe's neighborhood without making sure that you have a united policy towards a very belligerent Russia. And this connects as well with other things that the European Union has to do, which is not just hard security. So we're talking about weapons and technology and so on. But there are other aspects of security, energy security, for which the Europeans have not been great. And this is particularly, I would point at Germany, and this is one point that I'm going to give to former President Trump, when he said that it's not excellent that Germany is actually investing in Russia, the country that we're supposed to defend you against. And Germany did invest in having a very strong codependence with Russia in securing its energy and in investing in a growth model that was very much relying on cheap gas from Russia. Now, all these things are being done. So the European Union is not only investing in hard security, it's investing in decoupling its energy from Russia, and it's looking for new partners, and it's looking for partners to support a green transition, while also taking into account that these are policy movements that can hurt in the short run. They can hurt different segments of society, and we can see that it's having a backlash in the kind of votes that are coming out of Europe as well. So there's a lot of balancing that is going on, but I want to stress the point that Europe is changing. It's changing its security position through its policy of enlargement, through its policy of investing more in defense, and it's trying to do something that President Macron, who is not doing very well currently, has actually stated very clearly. We cannot allow future of Europe to be decided by voters in the United States. It has to be a partnership, and it has to be an investment in what the European Union is capable of doing on its own as well.
I'll be very quick. So the question is, so I said, because of this institutional safeguard, even if we have a new president, for example, Trump, we will not see a huge swing. And then Professor Song's question is, there is a lot of report that, the quality of, democratic institution in the U.S. deteriorated. Yes, true. So let me say three things. First, if you ask me, what is the biggest debate in American politics today, I would say the rise of administrative state. So that means bureaucracy is a giant. And that even though we have 2 million, federal bureaucrats, they make, more than 90% of the policies in the U.S. So what does that mean? Who's the boss of this 2 million federal bureaucrat? President. So that means, president has a lot of discretion, through the political appointees and, in the bureaucracy, right? So that, means maybe, now president doesn't really need to worry about the Congress and judiciary, might engage in more unilateral actions. And you see that, yes, since Obama, we see an increase of, unilateral action through the signing of the executive order because the Congress doesn't support the president's priority. Then, how does the public respond to executive orders? You might think that, president doesn't actually get any criticism by signing these EOs. No. There is a robust research in American politics that public do not support unilateral action by the president. When, president engage, this unilateral action is not supported by the public, the approval rating goes down. So there is still, I think, institutional constraint. But actually what I worry most is American public's perception change. Trump not only changed Republican Party, he changed Democrats. How? So after Trump, Democrats now, if you do a survey, they support undemocratic actions to get the power. So gerrymandering. So there is a lot of gerrymandering, which means manipulating electoral district to give a power to your own party. In the past, not everybody supported the gerrymandering, but now you see an upward trend that even Democrats actually support this gerrymandering, executive actions, etc. So because of this, that means a lot of public now support undemocratic behaviors and norms. So that really worries me because the public are the only players who could really change politicians' incentive.
Okay, thank you so much for wonderful answers. But we have a very interesting questions. We also running out of time. Sorry about that. But some questions are actually answered by our presenters. So I think I should close our first session. So please thank the four wonderful presenters with a big hand of applause.